Welcome to the EmberMap podcast, where we discuss design and development in the world of Ember.js. My name is Sam.
I'm Ryan.
And today we're joined by special guest, Oli Griffiths.
Hello.
Welcome, Oli. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, we know you from the Ember NYC meetup, and we brought you in today to talk about what you've been working on and also your upcoming Broccoli trainings at EmberConf.
Yeah.
So you have a dry run of those coming up pretty soon.
Yeah, so we've got a dry run on Wednesday. It's at Adapar. The idea is I'm going to make sure I have enough content, or too much, I don't know, and either trim it down or pad a lot so that I get to the rough 3-hour mark for EmberConf.
Yeah. I always find that you go in thinking oh, I'm an expert and they want me to teach this, so I'm going to come in with 14 bullet points, and then you give your first training and you're on point 3 and it's been 2.5 hours. And
yeah, that was basically us last year.
Basically, yeah, exactly what happened.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep it as slim as possible on the slide front. There's really only 3 concepts that I'm trying to cover, and then it's just straight into code and
nice.
Just let's everybody follow along. And hopefully by the end of it, you'll have a built JavaScript app. But I'm not giving away any secrets as to what that app might be yet.
Nice.
I found last year that doing code was great. It let people interact with each other. We kind of had everyone pair up and work on these exercises, and it was that was a highlight of the training for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I want to get across is that for me, before I knew much about Broccoli.js, it seemed very mystical and magical, and it was this scary thing. And it was only since I've started doing the work for EmberConf that I started digging into the internals and realized, this is really actually quite simple. What it does internally is really straightforward, but there's all these magical terms like trees that get thrown around. You're like, what's that?
You had a similar experience, right?
I did. I was just going to say, maybe before we get into it, let's just, for listeners who haven't heard you or met you yet, why don't we just do a quick introduction? So why don't you just tell us a little bit about kind of who you are, where you work, how you got into Ember?
Sure. So, hi, my name's Oli. I moved to the US 5 years ago to work for a small digital creative company called Expand the Room. And prior to that, I was in the UK for about 6 years, working as a full stack developer at a startup. So it started with just myself and another chap, and built up the technology stack there, primarily doing backend, but a bit of everything. And that was all back in the jQuery and just raw CSS days. So things have progressed a lot since then. And it wasn't till I moved to the US and started working on a project for a client of Expand the Room that I came across Ember.js. Actually, right at the end of the development cycle, where I basically implemented a really bad version of Ember.js.
I think that's a lot of people.
That's how everyone finds Ember, right?
Yeah,
it's you implement something and you're like, what have I done?
And you're like, wait, Yehuda did this. He probably did a much better job.
I came across and I was like, man, they've literally done everything I tried to do and did it way better.
So you're pretty big in the PHP community here in New York. We were just talking about before the podcast.
Yeah, so I'm actually not a front-end developer, which most people are kind of surprised at, because I tend to talk more about JavaScript than I do about back-end stuff. But I've been doing back-end PHP, also client-side iOS for the last 10 years. And had my hand in JavaScript, but my day-to-day is back-end.
Yeah, well, that is surprising, because you were at one of our talks recently at Ember NYC, and I just remember you asking a lot of really insightful questions that demonstrated that you knew at kind of a deep level what was going on with some of the problems we were talking about. So. And also, I think the first time I met you, you had rebuilt Tumblr in Ember as a side project. Yeah,
so we had a whole thing at Tumblr a couple of years ago. We have these labs projects, and this was born off the back of a hack day, which we had at Tumblr. So at one of my first hack days, I decided a good idea would be to try and rebuild Tumblr in 24 hours as a single page app. And it turns out that's really hard to do in 24 hours. So
you got bit by a bug and you had to keep
yeah,
going
I was like,
with it.
oh, this is actually really kind of cool. I want to see if we can take this further. So the original intention was just to rebuild the app using the API and not as a separate website. So we kind of have sort of two code bases or a split of the code base in some areas where we have to maintain two separate stacks, which I was like, this doesn't make sense. Let's try and build a web client that works off the API the same as our mobile clients do.
I see.
So that was the original intention. We then went through building out a Ember version of Tumblr as a proof of concept and got it to the point where I was able to persuade other people at Tumblr this is something we should be doing. And off the back of that, they're now doing a full rewrite of the Tumblr application in React as the platform that they're using. So achieved the goal, which was power everything off the API, slightly different details.
Yeah, right. So that's cool. And it sounds like maybe you had some native experience. And I was curious how much of that carried over to doing this kind of, I guess, fat client architecture, whether it's with Ember or, iOS apps.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about doing both backend and frontend is that you backend typically with stateless languages like PHP, Ruby, and so on. You don't have to think about state or memory management or any of that kind of stuff. And once you start delving into the front-end world, especially with something like Ember, you have a stateful application. So you have to start thinking about memory management and doing things on main threads and so on and so forth, which just aren't even concepts to a back-end engineer.
They get a hard refresh every time.
Exactly. But the flip side of that is a lot of back-end languages have a very structured, like MVC structure. So for me, coming from back-end PHP to Ember, I could pick it up and I was like, oh, this is really straightforward. Like when I originally started with Ember, it was all controllers and views and components were becoming a thing. So to pick that up initially was like, oh, this makes sense. It's MVC. It's super easy to pick up, and that makes sense because it's kind of a throwback from Ruby and so on. So the initial design concepts translate very well. And still a lot of the same semantics apply between the two. There are just different concerns.
Right.
With the front end, especially with the front end JavaScript and web front end, you start having to deal with like asset management and cache invalidation and all of that kind of stuff, which you just don't generally have to deal with for iOS or Android. You ship a new binary and you hope people download it.
Right.
So it's interesting. I think each different facet of front end development comes with its own benefits and drawbacks.
But you had already been, I feel like one of the most difficult parts of writing, an Ember app or just more generally like a stateful JavaScript app is state, right? It's thinking about how data flows through your app, how to refresh it when it gets stale. And so those concepts, maybe those higher level concepts carried over, or would you say?
Yeah, I would say those things do generally carry over. It's when you start getting down into the weeds, when say you're dealing with Ember data, that things massively change. But actually Ember data as a data store has some similarities with like core data in iOS. So there are similar patterns even there. So
cool.
Yeah.
So getting back to Broccoli, we were talking about how it's very, it can seem very opaque from the outside, indecipherable.
Yeah.
Until you kind of peel back the layers. We had a Broccoli course come out on EmberMap last year, and I did a lot of research for that. I mean, just speaking with folks, getting my hands dirty, writing some plugins. And it's true, like there's a lot of terminology and some abstractions that make it a little hard to waver through. But once you kind of get there, it's very reasonable. It's very straightforward.
Yeah.
Actually, it almost feels like a functional approach to the file system.
Yeah.
So why don't you talk a little bit about kind of what you've learned, like what your approach has been?
So I can probably try and distill Broccoli down into the simplistic terms as possible, is that Broccoli is a state management machine for the file system for transformations of files from an input to an output. And that's essentially all a build pipeline is. You have a bunch of inputs, you do stuff to those files, and you have you have a single output. An output directory where you write your CSS, your JavaScript, your HTML, your images, etc. And all you're trying to do is take those input files, filter them, parse them, do stuff to them, and write them out. And what Broccoli internally does is just hook up the pieces to be able to go from each single state to another. So you may select your JavaScript files, you then may process them through ESLint, you then may process them through Babel, you then may concatenate them together using some concatenation, or you may use some kind of bundler like Rollup, and out the end comes a JavaScript file. And each one of those individual states is managed by Broccoli, and so the individual plugins just deal with, I have some files that are coming in, I do stuff to them, and I write them to an output directory. That's literally all it does. And it has some other stuff around it, like the CLI and the Express server to be able to render your files within the browser, etc. But on the face of it, that's kind of all it does. So it's actually really simple. But there's all these terms that get thrown around like trees that you see them and you're like, I have no idea what this means and how it does all this stuff connect together. And I think one of the biggest issues with Ember is that because a lot of that is abstracted away behind the add-on system, when there is a problem, it's very difficult for you to try and track down where that problem exists. And because you're not managing the full dependency graph of A goes to B, goes to C, goes to D, and gets written to the output, then when there is a problem, tracking down where that is and visualizing the build graph, I suppose, is kind of tough.
Right.
Whereas if you've been forced to do it, with Webpack, for example, because you have been forced to set it up, when there is a problem, it's easier for you to understand where that problem is. So it's like...
Right.
You know, like where to hook in and stuff, like where to start debugging.
Yeah, like if you can see in the output trace, oh, there was an error in Babel. Cool, I can see by looking at my configuration where I'm using Babel. When in Ember, it's a plugin that's hooked in somewhere to some hook that you have no concept of.
Yeah. It's kind of like a double-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, you install Ember CLI font awesome.
Yep.
And you have, who knows? You have font files that are put into your app bundle and loaded and minified. You don't even know what's happening. It just works. Or, Ember SVG jar that takes an SVG and inlines it. And I mean, that's crazy, but you don't have to know anything about that. So when it doesn't leak, it's great.
Yep.
But if it does, and most abstractions do from time to time that aren't perfect abstractions, you do have to kind of dig in. So you were just talking about how, most of us have touched Broccoli at some level, at some point, even lightly. But, running training and teaching it really forces you to understand it. And you were just telling me how you basically have been going through some of the source code.
Yeah, so the folks that make Broccoli have done a great job in the last few months of converting the core Broccoli source code into ES6 classes, which for me personally makes them much easier to understand.
I think
it's so much easier to grasp.
For everyone.
Prototype dot whatever.
Yeah.
I don't have to read a file and try and mentally build a model in my head of what the class is. It's right there in front of me.
Right.
So it's been a lot easier to go through that and understand what the concepts are. There are still some abstract concepts that you have to understand, but in Broccoli there's really only two, and it's nodes and plugins, and everything is built up off that. And nodes are basically an abstract representation of a file or a set of files, and a plugin is the thing that you would interact with as a consumer of that API. So I want to use the Broccoli transpiler plugin, or I want to use the SAS compiler plugin, whatever those are the things that actually do the transformations. And that's kind of it.
And a node is the same thing as a tree?
So yes, but I kind of want to get that redefined.
Yeah.
So the terms are used interchangeably. A node basically has n number of inputs, which are input directories, and one output directory. So you can think of it like a single sort of tree, one stalk and then some inputs. And a node can be a single input or it can have multiple inputs. So something like Broccoli merge trees, its intention is it's taking multiple nodes and it's going to merge them all into a single output directory. Whereas when you reference your input directory, like app, that would be a single node. That would be a node with a single input. You can't have multiple sources for a single input node.
I think I remember Joe List talking about this as well, and feeling like tree was maybe confusing or unnecessarily kind of just like a kind of an abstraction that was like it's a node. It's almost like a file system node.
It's a node, and I think the thing with a node is you're now going into sort of like graph theory a little bit, and Broccoli. The tree aspect of Broccoli makes sense when you start thinking about your entire build pipeline.
Yeah.
You ultimately have a single output directory. And this is actually how Broccoli works. In your Broc file, when you return your final thing as your module export, whatever that is, it starts from there and it spiders up the tree to explore everything and build up all of the input nodes of all of your build pipeline until it gets to the top, which are essentially your source nodes, your source input directories, sets up file watchers for them. Then when you change any files, it builds from top down to the bottom. So it actually explores from the output, the final output directory up to everything.
Really? Oh,
and in my mind, that's a tree. Like that makes sense. You've got different nodes of the tree, which are different branches, and off those branches come other branches and so on. So in my mind, that's what the idea of a tree in Broccoli kind of should be. It's the combination of both nodes and plugins.
So once you take the set of all plugins that you're running your pipeline through, feed in the input nodes, and you end up with that Broccoli program that's ready to kind of build and rebuild, you could think of that whole thing as a tree.
Exactly.
Because that's basically what it looks like. That's interesting. I have a follow-up question. So earlier last year when we were talking with Steph and Robert about the concat part of EmberCLI's build, they talked about how that they wanted to work on that, and right now they kept saying it was a naive concat. So the idea being you do all your processing and then you need to kind of bring things together. Now we have something like Rollup, which is more intelligent, but one of the hard parts with the naive concat is that it took all these modules and put it in a final thing, and it was hard to know where the pieces came from.
Right.
Because if you knew where the pieces came from, you'd be able to better like cache and validate certain parts that needed to be rebuilt, or there was a specific problem that couldn't be solved with Broccoli, but I can't remember what it is right now. But basically, it sounds like Broccoli does know where everything comes from.
Yes.
It could build a graph of the dependencies.
Sort of. It only knows about files.
Okay.
So it wouldn't be able to do things that like Rollup does, which is actually introspect the code itself.
That's what it was.
It just knows
to import a file in a JavaScript file or a CSS module in a Sass file.
Yeah, so it doesn't know about the contents of files. It just knows about the files themselves. And even then, it doesn't know internally what a plugin is doing. You could shell out to a bash script in a Broccoli plugin if you so chose to do so. And so all it knows is I provided these files and the plugin emits files to a directory. That's kind of all it knows.
It couldn't say, right.
So the idea is if any of those input files change, it basically has to run the whole process.
Yeah, and so certain plugins have, there's a Broccoli plugin that you can extend from that will add caching support to your plugin. So you can say, okay, if none of the input files change, then don't
return the cache.
Yeah, return the previous output state, essentially. The last time I did a build, return that because my inputs haven't changed. But
if you wanted to get more granular and you had like a JavaScript file that imported like 10 JavaScript files, and you could do something intelligent where only one of them changed, you wouldn't have to worry about the other ones. You can't really do that. Or you would just have to do it manually. Broccoli doesn't know how to do any of that.
No idea, yeah.
Interesting. So I think that's exactly what they were talking about. And I think there was some talk about if you could write plugins that were more intelligent about things like ES6 imports, static imports in ES6, or Sass imports in Sass, then you could optimize a lot of the builds.
Yeah, you could certainly. So in the case of Sass, for example, if you had the equivalent of something like Broccoli, but for Sass specifically, then you could invalidate certain import pathways, and you wouldn't need to rebuild necessarily you wouldn't need to recompile everything.
Right.
But in terms of JavaScript, yeah, you could do that. But honestly, I would use Rollup.
Right,
Like
Rollup.
that's what it's designed, exactly what it's designed for.
Right.
So what does Rollup do? Where the...
So Rollup is a JavaScript bundler that the initial release does two things. It does dead code elimination and it does tree shaking. So dead code elimination is if a section of code can guarantee to not be used, like if you did if false and put something inside that branch, that can just be removed. It knows, it statically analyzes it, and it knows we can delete this code. We don't even need to ship those bytes.
Rollup does that in a single file. Even.
In a single file.
Oh, cool.
I believe. It'll also do if you import code from another module and you don't use that module. So if you do import foo from bar, if you import that and use that variable, it'll just strip that out. I may be wrong about that branching logic, but I'll check on that.
Something about dead code elimination.
Yeah, so if you import something and you don't use it, it can get rid of that. Tree shaking.
Then it takes up all the modules and just...
Yeah, so then it can work on several output modes. One of them is the ability to be able to inline within the current scope. So if you have an entry file and that says import foo from bar, and foo is a string in the file bar, it just inlines that.
Oh, nice.
As foo equals bar. Same goes for importing objects and anything that can be anything that it knows. This doesn't need to be evaluated at runtime. I can just import it where it is. Even functions, I believe, can also be imported. And basically it'll work out what like the common pathway is of all the modules that need those things, and it'll hoist that stuff up to a common context so that those things have access to those variables and objects and whatever.
Cool. I've heard a lot of high praise about Rollup from folks on the Ember core team.
Yeah, it seems really cool.
I think if it was around a couple of years earlier, I think it will continue to play a larger role in Ember CLI's pipeline.
Yep.
And I think what it does, it's limited to basically ES6 static imports,
yes,
right?
That one of the caveats is it's using ES6 because it's a specific standard for JavaScript to define how dependencies are declared.
Right. And
the documentation site says we decided not to use CommonJS and AMD and so on because those A, aren't official standards, and B, have various quirks that mean we can't do this. And everybody's moving towards ES6 anyway, so we might as well use that.
I was going to say, as an Ember developer, that sounds great.
Right.
Yeah, so
especially if it unlocks static analysis that you don't get with like runtime require or whatever, which I know you can do with CommonJS.
So they're working on there's two experimental additions to Rollup. They are working on code splitting, so much like what Webpack does, where you can define multiple entry points. And it'll say, okay, for these different entry points, what are all the common modules that are used between all those things, and write them out to a shared or common JS. And then each of the individual entry files, it'll just write out their individual builds. So that could then be used by something like Ember Engines to say, okay, well, we're going to write out our equivalent of like a vendor file or our main.js, which is all the common modules. And then each individual route could be written out to a separate JavaScript file for just the stuff that's included within those routes.
Interesting.
That's awesome.
Cool.
We work on an app now where we have like the front end and then the admin area. Mm-hmm. It's all one app. It doesn't need to be
separated.
But we just do it because it's the easiest thing to do today.
Right.
So it'd be awesome to have a good code splitting story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's becoming more and more required. By people as people start moving more and more of their apps to the front end. It's only going to become the standard practice at some point.
You want to render that homepage super fast, and you don't want it to pull in.
Why ship stuff you don't need?
4 megs of JavaScript.
Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting. I mean, it just makes me think of like a lot of the fast boot stuff we've been talking about, because basically, if you have a homepage that's only this big and it needs to be fast, but it brings along 4 megs of JavaScript with it.
Yep.
And one solution is to figure out code splitting. Another is to do caching in a way that makes it so that it doesn't matter. But I guess ideally,
it still matters your first page experience.
It still matters because they're still downloading it, even if they get the render initially.
Yeah.
If you could do it really quick. And basically, you have an entire admin section that no end user needs to see ever.
Yeah.
Why ever give it to them? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, exactly. And you can do some of that stuff with engines right now, but there's only certain things that you can split off into their own separate app. Like, for example, Ember data models have to exist globally.
I see, or services.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So one of the sort of drawbacks of Ember is because it has a resolver, there are certain things that a static analysis cannot deal with at build time and cannot know about.
Well, my question was going to be along those lines is, of course, in Ember, we don't just have JavaScript files.
Yep.
We have handlebars templates.
Yeah.
Which are, like you said, I mean, notoriously difficult to statically analyze because even for the resolver, which is built for it, you see curly foo.
Yeah, I think I think the way that Ember is evolving with the removal of, there's an RFC for using this.foo to refer to properties on the component, and remove this sort of fuzzy fallback where it goes, is it on the component? If it's not there, is it a helper? If it's not there, etc.
So you can actually look at a template and say, here's its dependencies.
Yeah.
That would be awesome. I mean, both for the static analysis side and for your understanding as a developer.
Yeah, understanding and also tooling. You'll be able to eventually at some point command click on that and it will take you to the definition.
Now that would be cool.
So there's a lot of things that can be done once you can be assured of what things are in your code. And yeah, we can analyze handlebars templates. They can be converted to an abstract syntax tree. There are already parsers that do that. And that's essentially all that Rollup is doing, is it's taking this tree structure that represents your code and analyzing it and working out, and only basically looking at like import statements, for example, and going, oh, well, this isn't used, so get rid of it or inline it or whatever it might be.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it's almost like we need a Rollup for handlebars.
Yeah, it'll be doable.
And then you could just throw that into a Broccoli plugin and then boom, you're good to go.
So long as once we get to the point where double curly something means one thing.
Yeah.
We're
in a much better spot.
Yeah, you're in a much better spot.
Yep.
Because otherwise you can't. If you can know it at build time, you can make determinations about that. If in any way it can be affected at runtime, then you can't do anything at build time with it.
I see. So you potentially could write something today, even though ambiguity exists within the template. You could write something that says, okay, I see curly foo in the template. Let's say, get rid of the property case.
Yep.
Let's say I'm going to look first for a helper. There's no helper called foo. Then I'm going to look for a component called foo. I can say, okay, I know it's a component.
You could use the runtime resolver at build time to determine some of these things.
Clever.
But if that runtime resolver can be affected at runtime, like if that thing that's being resolved could change at runtime, then
you're out of luck.
You're out of luck. Like for example, the component helper, for example, it doesn't know what the value is until the data is provided at runtime. So it could be component A or it could be component B.
Yep.
So there's no way at that point to statically analyze that and determine, like, am I passing the correct properties to this component? Because the whole point of it is it's kind of left up to runtime.
Yep.
So there'll be things that can be done and things that can't be done. And the stuff that can't be done will end up in common. So the common.js file. So it should just continue to work. It just may not be necessarily as efficient as it might be able to be.
Interesting.
Yeah, I've heard folks mention the component helper with like, oh, we can't do this tree shaking or eliminating code.
Yeah.
I think you can look at it though, and like when you use a component helper, there's usually only like a small set of components you plan to plug in there.
Maybe.
So you can
I'm wondering how eager developers.
Well, I mean, you're not going to be plugging in all of your components up there.
I mean, you could.
You could, but you're not.
Hopefully you're not. I mean, I'm not. I know I'm not. I just don't know about other developers.
I think the times where we use it, it's like there's like 4 or 5 components.
Right.
Yeah.
So you could just whitelist all those.
Right.
So
you could whitelist them and say, I know I'm going to need them. Yeah. They're used by this template.
These are like pluggable components or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, so what I found really interesting is I've worked on the React app that Tumblr is working on, and the experience of working in TypeScript with the React application, we're using TypeScript and prop types for both build and runtime validation of your dependency graph and data. And using those two things together, along with React, it is really, really nice. Like the developer ergonomics are awesome. You can command click on anything and it takes you to the definition.
Wow.
And it's like, coming from Emberland, it's like, wow, this is like a real programming API.
Yeah.
And then you come back to Ember and you're like, like there's magic here and it's super powerful, but
At the end of the day, you're gonna have to know where this thing is.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to open this component.
And I think that's one of the biggest blockers for Ember is that there is a certain amount of tribal knowledge that you just have to know about how certain things work in order to be able to look at a template and go, I know exactly what's happening here.
Yeah.
And the ability to be able to define everything statically and make sure everything is typed and so on, not only is great from a developer ergonomics perspective that you can command click on stuff and find the definition very easily, but also it gives you inline in your editor warnings when you pass the wrong thing into the wrong component.
You don't have to wait until you happen to hit that in Chrome.
You don't. Yeah, exactly. You're either hoping that at build time you don't have a failure with Ember, or realistically most of the time it's going to be a runtime issue with those kind of things, because there's just no way to know that you can't even define on a component what the properties are.
Yeah.
Well, you do property name : null.
Yeah.
That's what we do.
Right. But there's no ergonomics for that.
Right.
It's left entirely up to you.
Entirely up to you. Yep.
So there's no way to do that, because there's no standard way of doing static analysis and error highlighting and so on that.
Yeah. It's actually happened to me like 2 weeks ago. I was working with a component that took a model, and this component was all over our code base. And I went in and I modified that component to do some stuff and like did insert element. And then like half our test suite started failing.
Right.
And it turns out that like half of the code base was passing a promise into the model,
there you go.
into the component, and the other half was passing in a model. And it's like, I had no idea. If you asked me what this component was taking, I would have told you it's taking a model.
Yep.
And I wish I had something that at build time or at runtime could give me that warning that, hey, you think you're using a model, but you're not really.
Yeah.
But then you wouldn't have an opportunity to rage tweet about it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And then rage podcast about it.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Well, then you would just do a tweet about union types and say, oh, I've just found this awesome feature in TypeScript.
So I was going to ask you, like, you have a lot of experience across a lot of different platforms, communities, technologies. We've talked a lot about this kind of static analysis stuff. I mean, it's really like a theme of the last year, I think, in front-end JavaScript land. And it took the community a long time to figure out, how to do static imports.
Yep.
And we are getting, more widespread adoption for things like TypeScript and Flow. Is it right? Flow is the type annotation.
That's the
from
Facebook version.
So I was just I'm kind of curious to your thoughts on how it compares in JavaScript to other technology and ecosystems that you've been part of. Do you see it as like a maturity thing, or do you see it as like we were here on the pendulum of like dynamic and then we're like swinging back, but like it's gonna course correct again? And is this just like, is it gonna keep going like this, or is this really the new stuff that we're getting? Is it really a truly better way to develop and write software?
I feel like there are always going to be people who will say that static analysis is for lazy developers and you should know what your code is doing.
Is that really an argument?
I've heard that. Like, if you don't know what you're passing into your code, then you are a bad developer, and that's just
I can
straight out wrong.
By the way, I can totally see this being an argument.
That's true.
I take the approach that you want to catch as much stuff before you ship to production as possible. This is why we write tests, and static analysis is just a different kind of test. It's just a test that's run for you by your tooling rather than you having to manually write it. So why wouldn't you want that?
Right.
What's interesting is the PHP community has only recently even had the ability to put types within the language.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So since PHP 7, which was released about 2 years ago now, they introduced full scalar type checking across the language. There'd only been a very small subset of things that you could type check within the language itself. And the adoption has been great. People really like it because you can check, even just as you're writing the code, if you're using an IDE, it'll warn you immediately if you're doing the wrong thing.
That's amazing.
That is amazing.
That's great. Unfortunately, because PHP is uncompiled by its kind of nature, it's a scripting language, you can still write something and ship it to production, but you can add tooling around that to make sure that when you check the files, you can statically analyze them and ensure that you are doing the right things, the things you expect yourself to be doing. So I've set up a static analysis tool for PHP at Tumblr that comments on your pull request or fails the pull request if you passing the wrong thing around and so on.
So it's not as strong as getting a build that literally doesn't work.
Yeah.
Because you can always throw that PHP script on the server.
Yeah, it's an uncompiled language.
Yeah.
Well, it's mostly uncompiled. It's not a ahead of time compilation. It's runtime compilation. So you can still fail at runtime, but that's the whole point. That's what we're trying to not have, is runtime failures. So.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, I really don't have a lot of experience in, I guess you'd say that really JavaScript and Ember CLI and kind of the modern tools around JavaScript and front-end development are my main introduction to ahead of time anything. And it is great. It is great when you use an add-on that you install and you use it the wrong way and you just get a build error in your terminal instead of waiting for a reload, clicking on the link and then seeing what happens.
Yeah, and not only that, but just like hoping that you've triggered all the scenarios in the browser that you expect that thing to be doing. Like the old school way, which was like save a file and drag and drop via FTP and cross your fingers that it does what you think it's going to do.
It's a long feedback loop.
Yeah, it's a long and dangerous feedback loop.
Yes, and I found myself wanting it even earlier and earlier. So, I install an add-on and then it tells me, here's how you configure it, open up Ember CLI build or config environment, add this key, and then set this option. It's like even at that step, I want to know did I spell something wrong? I mean, it's just a string and an object. I mean, if you use the wrong one or an object that's a string that's unsupported, you have no feedback.
Yep.
I mean, now I notice that Ember CLI, if you run like ember serve -- path, it'll say like path is not supported, because it was output path or something like that.
Oh, right.
So it's like, I feel like these stronger static typing things are making their way more and more throughout the ecosystem, throughout our tooling, and I think it's great.
Yep.
I mean, from my perspective, there's very little downside. I guess the argument that I've heard comes from folks who have been like jaded from other tools and ecosystems where you kind of go crazy and you annotate everything. And also because abstractions are so hard to get right, maybe types and annotations can lock you into things that are harder to change later.
Yeah, that's absolutely a thing. There is an acronym that I forget what it is now, but essentially it's the part of the solid principles. And one of those determines, always forget which one it is, determines inheritance and abstractions. And essentially the idea, it's the substitution principle. So
the S in solid?
Yes. So if you have a function foo and accepts an interface of A, and I subclass that and I change that interface to B, anything which I could have originally passed that original class of foo to
Liskov substitution.
The Liskov substitution.
I think S is
single responsibility,
right?
Yeah. So it breaks this idea of like typing with an interface that's something that you could override in a subclass. If I can pass the original class foo as a dependency to something else, and that has a method called A on it, and that method I can pass some other dependency. If I subclass that and I can change that dependency, change that method signature to accept some other thing, then it's going to break when I try and pass something that's not what I expect to it. And
even though it would have worked if you didn't have
if I didn't have the typing,
it
would have worked. It wouldn't have failed at runtime or build time or whatever your language is doing. And so, you can kind of chain yourself in a little bit, but if you're doing that, then probably your abstractions are wrong. If you can't do what you're trying to do, it's not really the typing that's causing you a problem. It's probably the abstraction.
Yeah,
and so it's very easy to blame.
Subclassing and then overloading and with a different interface. It seems like
it's very easy to blame the typing as the problem rather than the architecture.
Does the typing nudge you towards certain kinds of architectures that it wouldn't if you didn't have those?
I don't know.
If you had the flexibility, I guess we're talking about duck typing, right? Where you have a component that displays a list item and all it needs is a title property. So I can pass in a series, I can pass in a video, I can pass in a podcast. All those things have title properties. And so my list item component will work with them.
So in that scenario, what you would want to do is have the concept of an interface. And each one of those components implements that same interface that has a title property or a get title method. And so it doesn't matter which subclass of those you pass in, it'll still work because it's always expecting that interface, and they all conform to that.
So you can say my thing is like summaryable, and it means it has a title and a summary and a description.
Yep.
And my video is summaryable, and my podcast is, and my series is.
Yep.
And now I have the feed time at the feedback at build time.
Yep.
That if I pass in a video into this component, it's going to say okay.
Yep.
But if I try to pass a blog post in, I'm actually going to get some like a lint error. Basically,
Yep.
I would be able to have something in my Atom editor that says this only accepts summaryable.
Yep.
And the blog post is not summaryable.
That's exactly the feedback that you
cool.
get with TypeScript, which is awesome.
Yeah. I need to dive into that. I haven't taken that one yet. Maybe I'll take
I'm sure is there a training session?
There's a training session, but I think I'm going to be busy. But maybe I'll ask him for a runner-up session.
Yeah, for sure. It's
Chris.
Yeah.
Chris is running it. Yeah. So that's interesting. So you guys use TypeScript at work?
Yeah. So the new project was TypeScript from the beginning. They evaluated Flow and TypeScript and bet on TypeScript. I think partially from a sort of community and adoption basis, partially on the tooling basis, and also that TypeScript is just a superset of JavaScript.
Okay.
So you're still writing JavaScript.
Oh, so I do know TypeScript.
Yeah, kind of.
I'm kidding.
And then you are adding on typing support on top of it. And essentially all the build ends up doing is kind of just removing the type stuff when it builds out to JavaScript.
Oh, okay.
So it can use that at build time, and then runtime, it doesn't have that. There are some things where you can write like annotated stuff out and use things at runtime, but I don't know if that's a TypeScript feature or if I'm thinking of Flow or something. But that's theoretically possible as well.
Very cool. Interesting. I'll be interested to see how typing in templates pans out. I wonder if other communities that use templates like Vue are running into some similar things, because don't they have lots of kind of string-based, template-based declarations that are not as easily typed as JavaScript files are?
I would have thought that whoever wrote the JSX plugin for TypeScript, I assume that exists because JSX is not a native JavaScript syntax, had the same issue. Like we have something.
But JSX is typed, you're saying?
No, JSX isn't. But if you create a TSX file, you can use JSX within your TypeScript file. So there has to be some parser that's going through, and not only does VS Code allow you, it knows about it, so you can command click in a VSX template segment and it will resolve that automatically. So it's possible. It's just got to be done. And so there's no reason why a handlebars file shouldn't be able to be done in exactly the same way.
I see. See. It just has to do with the resolver bit. Yeah, but
the resolver bit is the more difficult. Bit. But you could very easily write a handlebars resolver that would allow you to statically analyze that file and hook stuff up. But the more specific you can be about what things are, the easier that will be to make.
Cool. Basically. So who's going to write this? I'm ready for it. I'm ready to click on my templates. I want this.
Yeah, I don't know. You should talk to Chris.
Yeah, definitely. So let's bring it back just to kind of wrap this up. We kind of went on a lot of tangents, but that was a fun conversation for sure. Broccoli is the training you're putting on at EmberConf.
Yep.
It's next week.
Yes, next Monday, 9 a.m. Pacific time.
You're getting a trial run in here at the Ember NYC Project Night on Wednesday.
On Wednesday.
So that'll be good. So the folks at EmberConf are going to get a real polished version. That's great.
Fingers crossed.
And you'll have it done by then too, for sure.
Yeah, well, I have to.
But that's going to be mostly understanding kind of some of the stuff we talked about at the beginning, how to think about Broccoli. And then are you going to talk about, is it just Broccoli? Does it talk about Ember at all?
So, undecided yet, but tomorrow will determine that. Essentially what I would like you to be able to do, having gone through the training session, is A, not be terrified about what Broccoli is and understand some of the basic concepts.
Yep.
Be able to write a standalone Broccoli compilation pipeline. simple or complex, however far you want to go with it, but at least understanding. I declare a Broccoli.js, I put stuff in it, and I run Broccoli build and output. Some stuff gets output. Once you understand that, you understand how Ember CLI works, because Ember CLI itself is just a glorified Broccoli pipeline, which has internally a bunch of hooks to allow add-ons to be able to hook into the various different parts of the build pipeline. So they built their own kind of spec for what the Ember CLI build pipeline will be, and you can hook in with an add-on at those various steps. Knowing what those hooks are to allow you to make an add-on and hook into the build pipeline. That ideally is where I would like you to be able to get to. And hopefully we can do that within 3 hours.
There you go. That's great.
Yeah,
I mean,
that would be super valuable.
Super valuable because once I learned how Broccoli works, just being able to go into like you were saying, an Ember CLI add-on hook and manipulate some files and have them show up in my app.
Yep,
it's great. You know, that's super powerful because you just have that. You have that underlying tool chain that you can pull that tool out and go to work and get something done without relying on the add-on already to exist.
Yeah, I think that's what most Ember developers are looking to be able to do when they're trying to interact with Broccoli. It's a case of, it's not a case of I installed an add-on and I want to debug why that's not working, although we'll hopefully be able to do some of that. It's mostly, I have a use case and there isn't an add-on that exists for that. I know how to do this in Webpack, or I know how to do this in Gulp or Grunt or whatever, some other build pipeline that you may have used in the past. How do I do that in Ember?
Yep.
So since learning this, are there things that you're like, shit, I want to go build this now? Like, I want to go build this thing with Broccoli.
Yeah, so I'm actually working on a Broccoli plugin that will allow you to render out a visual representation of your build pipeline. So basically it'll render a tree.
Nice. And
from,
I can see
from the output directory and be able to see, okay, here's an or multiple input directories, and here's my tree of all. These are all the things that, all the plugins that are going through, and out comes a directory. And then, so that's step
one.
That sounds
amazing.
Yeah. So you can see like where
so you can literally see everything, all the add-ons, everything, the order of everything, so that you can see, oh, well, after this step is complete, then this is what happens next. Because that's all it is. And this is why I say, I think Broccoli is a sort of a file system state abstraction, that it is just dealing with the state of directory 1, do stuff. Output of that directory gets to be the input of the next plugin. That plugin then does stuff to those files and writes stuff to an output, and then the output of that gets hooked up to the input of the next one, and so on. So it really is just a tree of connections. And one of the difficulties, especially with Ember, is understanding what that tree looks like. You just have to kind of like cross your fingers and trust that it's going to work and stuff is going to be in the right order and so on.
Yeah, that's interesting. When you talk about like the visual output, like I know the least amount of Broccoli in this room, but I know things like, I know there's like tree for public,
tree for app,
Yeah. So if I could visually see like where those hooks come into play and how other things are feeding into that, I think that would help. I know that would help me because I just kind of know these things by name.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially what you would see would be an output, your final merge trees, which most Broccoli configurations will have the Broccoli merge tree at the end because it's got to output everything to a single directory.
App.js, basically, right? I mean,
well, not the whole dist directory.
Okay.
So your final merge is merging your public, your JS, your CSS, your vendor, like all of those things are getting merged at the end into an output. So you'll see that at the bottom. And then above that, you'll see all of the inputs to merge trees, which will come from all of those essentially different hooks that you can hook into. So tree for vendor, tree for public, tree for styles, tree for app, etc. And then one up from there will be whatever the last plugin that was registered for each one of those trees did, and then so on and so on and so on.
That would be so useful as both a teaching tool and just, like you were saying, demystifying what the heck's going on when I type ember serve.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely. And then what I would like to try and do, and I think it's possible, is after that to make that interactive so that you can click on any one of those plugins and be able to see the state and the contents of all the files that went in and all the files that came out.
That's super cool.
Which would really help with debugging, like, why am I getting this weird runtime error of something? Why isn't this thing defined? And you could click through and see, like that was removed there for some reason by this plugin or whatever.
That's so cool.
Yeah. I mean, yes.
Super cool.
So I think it's doable. I just got to work out how.
That's awesome. Well, the Ember community is super lucky to have you and hack on this cool stuff at night, even though I guess you moonlight as an Ember developer, even though you're a PHP and React guy by day.
Yeah, the irony.
But if folks want to kind of follow your work and get to know more about what you're all about, where should they find you on the web?
Just Twitter is probably the best one, at Oli Griffiths, OliGriffiths.
Cool.
Which will probably be in the video. I didn't probably need to spell that.
We'll make sure to put it in the show notes for sure.
There or GitHub / exactly the same thing, but most of the stuff on my GitHub is just me messing around with various projects. So
cool. And you're based here in New York City.
Yep.
And we see you at the Ember NYC meetup.
Yep.
So if you're ever in town, you come to
say
that.
hi.
Yep. And then also you do the what's the name of your PHP meetup?
It's the New York PHP meetup. So
easy to remember.
Yeah, very easy. So we'll have our next meetup is on April 2nd. So if you do backend stuff, I am trying to organize something kind of special for the next month. And I don't want to speak ahead yet because nothing is confirmed, but it should be a pretty good one for like the development community generally.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Sounds exciting.
Yeah.
All right, Oli. Well, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for everyone for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
This podcast is sponsored by EmberMap.com, where you can find high-quality videos and blog posts made specifically for professional Ember developers. Sign up today to access all of our premium content updated weekly.